All right, it is the week of November 29th, 2021, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and today we're going to talk about UFC Fighter Contracts. A new piece examines some analysis from the Antitrust lawsuit and focuses on how often a fighter's contract is up for renegotiation or a fighter has fought out their contract compared to the overall roster, and it's got some quite revealing information in it. So we're going to dive into that quite a bit in our first segment. Then we're going to talk about Triller purses. Triller had their Triad Combat pay-per-view. I don't even know the name of it, the official name of it. I'm not going to look it up. I don't care enough to look it up. Basically a large Metallica concert, right? With some MMA fights and bare-knuckle boxing. But the purses for fighters that participated in that event were highly publicized and made a lot of waves, especially because a lot of guys that were either mid or lower tier or would be mid or lower tier now in UFC fighter pay or other MMA pay, it was quite high for them. So we're going to look at that and also look at, is that sustainable for Triller moving forward? Why they were paid so much, all of that. Then we're going to talk about Kevin Lee. Kevin Lee has been released from the UFC, came as a shock to many, the former interim title challenger and high-ranked lightweight being released suddenly following his suspension for ADHD medication. We're going to talk about why the UFC did this, and it kind of fits into what I've been talking about on this podcast for quite a while now. I think Kevin Lee is the perfect example of the type of fighter the UFC is going to start cutting from here on out. Then we are talking about PFL. PFL is talking about introducing a challenger series and, more importantly, a pay-per-view model going forward. We'll talk about what that means for the organization following their season 3 finale that was not too long ago, and whether or not that's viable or how that could become viable for the organization in order to actually have a successful pay-per-view model. And lastly, we have a fan reader question. So I want to thank the fan personally, which we'll do during the segment. But if you have any other questions, make sure to hit me up as well. I always try and fit questions in when I can. This one is about pay-per-view numbers, why certain people are drawing at certain levels, and are there different types of UFC fans that really lead to these levels? So we're going to dive into that quite a bit. So with that in mind, timestamps at the bottom as always, and let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about today is an article that was published in Forbes magazine by Dr. Paul Gift, MMA Analytics. If you don't follow him on Twitter, make sure you do that as well. One of the big three in the UFC business analysis, in my opinion, him, John Nash, and Jason Cruz. And Dr. Gift goes over analysis that was done by Dr. Robert Blair in the UFC, or sorry, Roger Blair, in the UFC Antitrust lawsuit, where Dr. Blair is a professor of economics at the University of Florida and had access to over 2,500 UFC contracts because he was a witness for the UFC and was able to do a fair bit of analysis in terms of how often fighters are either renegotiating, fighting out their contract, or they're a new fighter that's just signed. I highly encourage you to go read the full article. I'm not going to dive into all the details here. That would be a disservice to this article because it's very well written. Got some great graphs in terms of showing how those percentages have increased over the years, what the free agency overall percentage looks like. But some big takeaways that we're going to take a look at here is, and I quote, according to Blair, free agents made up between 31.7 and 49.5% of the UFC roster in any given year, with the average coming in at 41.5%. In other words, 4 of 10 UFC fighters each year were either newly signed to the promotion or newly able to initiate negotiations with other MMA promoters. That's pretty big because it really tells that there's a lot of fighters in any given year that are trying to renegotiate, trying to sign with the UFC for the first time. It's a huge amount of the roster, 50%. Blair also categorized that fighters who renegotiated their contracts during a year, which tended to be smaller, ranged from 22.6 to 37.8%. So essentially 3 of 10 UFC fighters agreed to start a new contract each calendar year. They also go into that this isn't double counting in some instances, or he believes it isn't double counting. Again, highly encourage you to read the article itself. It's over at Forbes. It is titled Expert Analysis, Most UFC Fighters Change Contract Status Every Year. And that's really the takeaway from this, is that you're looking at a large number of fighters who every year their contract status changes in some form or fashion. Some they fight out their contract, some they renegotiate, some are just signing. But it really highlights that when we talk about the antitrust lawsuit and fighters getting locked into long contracts, there's always been an emphasis on bigger stars and bigger names, right? So if you're a Jorge Masvidal after the Ben Askren flying knee, or after beating Nate Diaz, if you're a Conor McGregor after, I don't know which fight really sent him over the edge, maybe Dennis Siver, I don't know. That's a tougher one to think about. But if you're one of these bigger name fighters that has got a name, Nate Diaz after he beat Conor McGregor, you're usually locked in or signed up for more fights and locked into that contract. But if you're not, or if you're not ranked, right, in the top 15, you generally are able to renegotiate much quicker. Now, these numbers go from 2008 to 2014, where this analysis was done. I think it's probably a safe bet to think that these numbers have only gone up in terms of renegotiation. And the reason why is because, again, you've got so many people coming in off of Contender Series contracts. And if they make a name for themselves quickly, right? If they're an Adrian Yanez, if they're a Terrence McKinney, although he lost his last one, but, if you're some of these up-and-coming young guys where you're really doing well quickly, you're probably going to renegotiate your contract and be put in for a bump in pay as well as a little bit longer stay. Because if you get hot, right? If you are an Adrian Yanez who then just takes off, Sean O'Malley is a great example of this. Newer prospect from Contender Series that has blown up in popularity. If you become one of those guys, they want to lock you in for longer because obviously you're bringing in more people. You've got a bigger connection with the fan base. You probably have a bigger casual fan connection. So with the Contender Series being there and a lot of guys coming up and getting one or two chances, right? Or from looking for a fight, I feel like it's more common now than back in 2014 that if you're a newly signed fighter, you're going to renegotiate your contract in a 12-month period. Because you'll probably have fought, you'll definitely have fought at least once, probably have fought twice, and depending on how those fights have gone, you're probably looking to re-up and renegotiate, depending on what the UFC sees in you, right? There have been some great fighters or some people that I think are huge on the regional scene that had tough stints in the UFC where they're gone after 2 losses, right? Derek Krantz, older guy, but, a long-time vet on the regional scene, ends up getting signed off of looking for a fight series down here in Texas that I attended. And then his first fight was a short notice against Song Yadong, I believe. And then the second one, I forget the second person he fought. He had a full camp for that one, but it was a rough opponent as well. And he gets beaten and he's gone. He's cut. That's not uncommon. We forget there are so many fighters, right? Like 600-ish at any given time. There are so many fighters that come up through Contender Series or through looking for a fight that get a couple of chances, and if they fail, they're gone. It would make sense that if you get a couple of guys that win quickly, they're probably going to get signed for an extension before they hit free agency, because if you had Cheyenne Bays, right? They pushed her very hard with JP Bays, and with Cheyenne, if you had her win all her fights, if she doesn't lose to Ruiz, And she's kind of got that marketing behind her and everything. She wins a couple fights. They don't want her to become a free agent and then negotiate a higher pay rate with someone like Bellator that then they're forced to match and really take a gamble with, right? Or if they really want her, they've got that, clause where they can match any offer if Bellator makes her a higher offer than she's getting paid in the UFC would have the right to match to keep her. They don't want to deal with that. They'd much rather, before she's done with her contract, renegotiate, sign up. And most of these contracts, again, are probably 3 fights, maybe 4, but I'm thinking closer to 3. I don't know for sure. It would make sense based on what we've seen. So, with how active fighters are, especially newer fighters that are out there trying to prove themselves, trying to do things, Lupita Gonidez, right? Great example there. With how active fighters are, it really makes sense that in a 12-month period, at any given time, fighters are renegotiating. And a large percentage of fighters are renegotiating. Because you got those guys, but then you've also got, veterans who've been around a little bit longer or who are taking maybe 2 fights a year, and it just happens to be the year that their, 3rd and 4th fight are happening. And even some of the longer guys, if you're ranked up in the top 5, again, if you've got 2 or 3 fights in your contract left, but you're knocking at the door of a title shot, they probably want to renegotiate before you get the title shot so that it's easier for them to keep you for longer. So that you don't, you're not in a Kevin Lee situation, which we'll talk about here, where you challenge for the belt and then you're a free agent if you lose and you're like, nah, I'm gone. I'm going to go over to Bellator. I'm going to go do this. They don't like that. They want to keep the high rank guys around. Right? So it's not shocking, but it does give you some insight that not all fighter contracts are locked in for huge amounts of time. And the fact that there's renegotiation, or there's this large percent of fighters, right? Like basically 7 out of 10 fighters at any given time in a year are dealing with contract negotiations. It speaks to some of the fluidity we see with cuts, to a lot of the announcements about who you consider not necessarily like hot prospects like O'Malley, but bright prospects re-signing new deals pretty quickly, or names that maybe we haven't heard from for a while, but they have a big fight and then all of a sudden they sign a new deal. It makes sense that that's happening, given everything going on with, the organization at this point, I guess. So keep that in mind. When we talk about fighters getting locked into longer contracted fights, it's usually ranked top 15 or champions, obviously. And it's still for those upper echelon guys more than anyone. If you're a middling guy, which we'll talk about with Kevin Lee, if you're a middling guy, you might not get locked in for that long. Or you might get cut for other reasons. Because you could be signed to 7 fights. If you lose 3 in a row, they might cut you anyway. Remember, it's a one-way street. The UFC can say, for a lot of different reasons, like, yeah, we signed you for 5 fights, 6 fights, but you know what? You're not performing. We're going to cut you. And that's what they want. They want the leverage there. That all of a sudden, if, we signed you for 8 fights, you were going to be the next Conor McGregor, and then you just drop the ball and lose 3 or 4 in a row, we can cut our losses. We don't have to keep paying you to just get beat up. Right? It's a power move. They have all of the leverage. So important to note, when we're talking about longer contracts, again, it's the high-rank guys, the bigger names, and that it is still a one-way street. It doesn't protect the fighters if they have longer contracts. And a lot of the new fighters, they're not going to sign them to long contracts because they're not going to want to pay that out. They don't want somebody who's super boring that they've signed, who they think there is a big prospect, and then they're super boring and they keep winning. They don't want them signed for long contracts where they have to keep them. If they don't like them, they may cut them anyway. We've seen that happen where fighters have gone out on a win because their contract just ended. UFC wants that option. It really gives them more power to have shorter contracts up front and longer as they get closer to a title shot. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. So again, great article. Go read it. It's important stuff. And yeah, just keep that in mind when we talk about fighter contract length, because people always focus on, locked in for that amount of time. It's important to recognize which fighters we're talking about. All right, next thing I want to talk about is Triller Triad Combat purses. And yes, I guess that is the official name, Triad Combat, at least for what I'm seeing, simply because, I had to look it up for the purse information. So I apologize at the beginning. I made it sound like I wasn't going to look it up, but I kind of had to. So we've got some reported purses for Triller Triad Combat. We have a lot of fighters saying they made more money. It's their biggest payday ever, right? Frank Mir, I believe, said biggest payday he's ever got. A number that we have, right? Important to keep in mind that athletic commissions don't disclose these purses anymore, so we don't know it from an objective source of truth. But, according to Mike Perry's manager, Malkikawa, he came out and said Perry's pay was over $250K. Now, I that's tough for me to, I don't know. Tough for me to believe that he was paid that much more than $250K, but even the fact that $250K was the number that was revealed from Mike Perry, right? That's the ballpark number. We've talked a lot about salaries and pay-per-view buys. Last week, we talked about how you can't trust UFC salaries reviewed. I don't necessarily trust these salaries, especially when a manager's saying he got paid more. I was like, yeah, maybe. It's hard to believe these for sure, but if that ballpark figure is even kind of correct, right? Let's say it's even half. Let's say he got $125,000. That's still so much more money than what he was getting in the UFC, right? That's much more money than he was making in the UFC probably. And he had fought in the UFC for a while. He was probably in that kind of middle range where maybe if he wins, he could be looking at a 120, 160K type thing, an 80 and 80. But for just a straight purse in a sport where he's not competed, and the fact that he's drawing that now compared to where he's left the UFC, so he would probably be fighting, maybe in Bellator or maybe in just regular BKFC, on a regular BKFC show, right? That's a huge amount of money. I feel that given what I know about Triller's spending habits, which is albeit very little, but what I've heard and what I do know, it wouldn't shock me if he was paid $250K. Right? If you look at their, one of the first ever Triller events where they did Jake Paul versus Askren, and you had so many celebrities, you had musical groups, you had all this crazy stuff going on. Triller loves throwing money at people for the spectacle, and they have big backing behind them, right? You can look at their events and just see who they're able to get from a celebrity standpoint, who they're able to book from various, promoter standpoints. It's they have the money to spend on people like this. Now, is it wise to spend that much money on Mike Perry? That's a different story, right? And on this particular event. But it just shows that with Frank Mir saying he's gotten the best payday ever, Mike Perry also clearly getting paid very well. It begs the question, is this sustainable? And the answer is a resounding no, right? Triller's pay-per-views numbers have been decent in the past. They certainly have. They've been good in the past, especially when you've got Mike Tyson. You've got Jake Paul, who we know is a draw because of his casual fan base. But in terms of making it profitable, and in terms of really, creating this space, this niche space for themselves, how many people turned in to try combat for Mike Perry? Right? It's going to be interesting to even just look at the pay-per-view buys for this event, which I have not seen any yet. Although let me take a look right now, live on air, to make sure they haven't come out while I am talking about this. It's not smart money management, right? You have Metallica playing a full show. And no, we don't have actual pay-per-view buys as of this recording. But, and it's headlined by, Frank Mir, who, God bless him, tries to fight Kubrat Pulev. I'm butchering the name, I know. Y'all know me. This is what I do, unfortunately. It's not sustainable, right? It's simply not. I cannot see a way that you turn a profit long term if these are the types of events you're hosting. Well, we'll see. We'll see what the actual pay-per-view numbers are. I did not see a lot of chatter about it on social media. I didn't see a lot of, even in the combat sports circles, a ton of talk about it. I don't think it did particularly well based on those factors and some other factors I know of, but I could be wrong, right? I've been wrong before, 2 weeks ago. But I cannot see the justification in paying Mike Perry $250K or more, or even close to $250K. I can't. It's making me cough just thinking about it. It's just giving me dry mouth thinking about Mike Perry making $250,000 and somehow some Triller exec saying, you know what? I bet Mike Perry will bring in 100,000 buys for us. Huh? But it's a ploy. It's a ploy to get their name out, to have a legitimate MMA fighter come in for their MMA versus boxing type of tournament, which was the whole thing. And then you have the Triad ring, which was the other big gimmick, and Metallica playing. So I get that, but it's going to be interesting to see what the return on this is, because I can't imagine the ROI is going to be well worth what they paid out if they're truly paying out that much to Mike Perry and to Frank Mir, who, again, God bless him, but he's way past his prime. It's going to be interesting, but it's not sustainable. It's like any startup. We've talked about this several times with the PFL, with one championship. You can throw a bunch of money at people. You can create and you can find companies that will, for any job, pay you well above market rate. And there'll be a new company. They say they're going to change the world. They'll pay you well above market rate for whatever your job is. They say, come on, be a part of the family, work out, all this stuff. That's fine. They'll do that. But then they have a runway to make profit. They're going to be losing money the whole time, trying to get new deals, trying to get bought in some cases, right? And they will do all of that to entice employees, or in this case, fighters, to come and fight for them. And for the employees or fighters, it works out very well, right? I mean, you're getting paid way more than you would at other places. It's all good, but sustainability isn't there. If pay-per-view buys come in for this event, and let's say it breaks 1 million or something insane like that, then that's a different story. Then, okay, this was totally worth the money. I'm sure they would still taper it down. I don't believe you're paying Mike Perry $250K every time. It's one of their first events, especially their first event with a Triad ring or whatever. So you don't keep that pay up, but that's part of the early adoption benefits for fighters. If you were a fighter in free agency and you see something like Triller, or you see a new org that has a fair amount of investment money that is just starting up, you want to strike early and first, because chances are you will get paid the top amount. And then they'll taper it down because they'll need to taper down costs, all of that as well. But you'll get paid very well for whatever you're doing, right? If you are Anthony Pettis and you're in season 1 of the PFL, probably a less competitive field than season 3. Same with Rory, and any of the UFC guys that came over, right? Brandon Loughlin, you're probably, not always, right? But you're probably in a less competitive field, and you could probably go farther and make more money if you're in season 1 of PFL than if you are in season 3. Because now they have better names. That's part of the reason they signed these UFC vets, and that they're signing more name value guys. Same happens with most things, most startups and most promotions. If you get in early, if you are employee number 10 in a startup and you get equity and you get stock options, and you're probably, as the company grows, you're probably then getting a bigger title, you're doing all these things, it makes a big difference. It does. Early adoption for fighters, for new orgs, that's, pounce on it immediately. If you're not going to the UFC and you're not trying to get the belt and make that pay-per-view money and all of that, or you're not a big name that somebody like Bellator is going to pay you a ton of money for, look for things like this, the Triller Triad Combat. Because if Mike Perry got paid $250K, think about what Anthony Pettis would get paid. Think about what, former champions or guys who have kind of fallen from grace. Cerrone, Donald Cerrone, great example of this, right? If his contract was up and he was done with the UFC and he still wanted to fight, think about how much they're paying for Cowboy to go do Triad Combat, right? But it's not sustainable long term. They will have to make adjustments, because even if it sells a ton of pay-per-view, breaks pay-per-view records, somebody's going to figure out they're overpaying cost-wise and eventually taper it down. That's what Endeavor did with the UFC. They came in and they said, you know what? We're paying these fighters too much. Let's go ahead and bring it down. Let's cap it at 20%. And doesn't even get to 20% every year. But let's go ahead and cut costs. Same type of thing. Every company, as they grow out of that hyper-growth startup mode, during it, they're much more willing to spend a ton more money up front, but then they start tapering down costs. Then they have to make a profit. Then it's not investor money anymore, where it's just this blank check of $300 million, what have you, from a bunch of investors or a VC. It's, now they have to make the money. Now it's their profit. Things change. When you make that switch, things change big time. So again, it's great that Frank Mir got paid that much money, especially considering his history and that he's a UFC Hall of Famer, right? Mike Perry getting paid that much? Well, that depends on your perspective, but from a business standpoint, unsustainable. Completely unsustainable. So fighters, if you're in free agency, look for a Triller. Especially when they're new. And especially if they're offering you that type of money. That's all I'll say on that. All right, so let's circle back around a little bit to fighter contracts in a way, and let's talk about Kevin Lee, who should be looking at a Triller, right? A lot of people were shocked by this. A lot of people said, he's still got a lot to give. He's 29 years old. He's definitely stumbled and had issues, right? Lightweight was a tough cut for him, and he had, lost a couple of key fights. That second Iaquinta loss was close, but I had Iaquinta winning the fight, but it was a close fight, and he had some setbacks in that division. So then he went up to 170 where he felt better, but couldn't really find the same success he had. And so, lo and behold, he gets popped for ADHD medication, so he gets to use USADA suspension, and he gets cut. A lot of people were shocked by this. A lot of people. And the thing is, when you look at where Kevin Lee fits in the grand scheme of the UFC's machine, what cog Kevin Lee is, it goes back to what I talked about a while ago, where the UFC has kind of a new business model where they want to sign a lot of Contender Series guys or looking for a fight guys for very low contracts and then push them pretty hard to see if they're either A, a superstar or not, B, not. And those middling veterans that are kind of struggling and out in that weird no man's land but are getting paid pretty well, they're going to get cut. Yoel Romero, great example. Pettis, they wanted to re-sign, and Romero too, right? Although they wanted them to fight new guys, and it was much more a, hey, you have name value, so beat me, and you can take my name value. They wanted them to be what Andrei Arlovsky is at this point in his career, right? Just bigger name guys where if you get a win over that person, well, it's a big name. And it shouldn't, right? Shouldn't catapult you that way, but it's always been the case. Chris Weidman is my favorite example of this recently. Weidman has been atrocious for a while now. I'm sorry, all you Chris Weidman fans. He has not done well on paper and in most fights. But you had Dominic Reyes fighting Weidman, and the winner was going to get a shot at John Jones. Doesn't make much sense to me, but, you know, Reyes beats him and, oh, it's his name value, go ahead. And at the time, Reyes was undefeated, right? It was a whole thing, I get it. But still, I mean, you have fighters like that where, oh, they beat a big name guy, like, and you have journalists do this too. I can't tell you how many journalists I've seen where it's like, well, they beat that name guy, so it's a big feather in their cap. They should probably get a title shot or a top 5 guy next. And it's like, what? It doesn't make sense. It really doesn't. Masvidal was a great example of this, right? Beats Till, which is arguably his strongest win, although, you know, yeah, I mean, it definitely is the strongest win at the time. And then he beats Askren, who had only beaten Robbie Lawler after, you know, a controversial ending to that fight in a couple of ways there, right? And then he beats Diaz, and off of Diaz, it's like, well, there you go. You deserve a title shot. When Diaz, I believe, beat Anthony Pettis at welterweight, and that was it. I mean, which Pettis was ranked only because he got a good shot off and knocked out Wonderboy in a fight that he was losing the majority of the fight. You know, it's one of those things where name value is big. So if you are sticking around the UFC after kind of having those middling performances, they now clearly want you in gatekeeper roles so that new prospects can beat you and use your name to maybe propel you up into stardom. That's what they want older guys for. With Lee, I don't know that they offered him that opportunity per se, but he, again, former title challenger, so you know he made good money off of that as well as renegotiated his contract. Probably following that, probably right before that, because that's what they tend to like to do. And then, you know, win, loss, all that stuff. I mean, it's the perfect mark for the UFC to cut because they don't want those guys anymore. They either want you to be a prospect, a shooting star, or a name value guy who's going to help a prospect become a shooting star. That's it. That's really the 3 types of fighters they're looking at. And then the top 5 of the division, right? That's really who they're looking for. You've got plenty of guys that have been cut. Antonio Carlos Jr., perfectly good fighter, right? And had some struggles here and there, but gone. Why? Because he's a middling guy that is no longer really a prospect on the rise and kind of struggled enough with the top echelon guys. He's just in the middle. He's in that 5 to, closer to, 10 to 15 range. Or you could say 5 to 15, depending on who he's fighting, all of that. And he's not going anywhere. They don't want to hold on to paying fighters like that, especially because those fighters are getting more, sometimes several times more than brand new prospects off of Contender Series on the 12K. So I see Kevin Lee's release as kind of inevitable. I think he's the first of many. And really, let me rephrase that. He's the first bigger name of many. They've been doing this for a while. We know that. Go back and look at recent releases and ignore the names like Romero and Pettis, who really fought out his contract rather than got released. But ignore those bigger names and look at some of the other names there. And you'll find a lot of guys that weren't necessarily bad, but just were kind of name value within hardcore fans and not doing much. We're kind of stuck between like, yeah, I can beat, 10 through 15, but I can't beat 1 through 8. Here I am. They don't want those guys. It's a lot of money to pay somebody to be a mid-level gatekeeper. That's not who they want. They want you, if you're ranked, to be, grinding to go up, or if you go down, to bounce back in a big way. But you only get so many chances. Part of the cost-cutting measures by the UFC. Part of the reason to keep fighter costs down below 20%. Look at the fight nights lately. People complain about the fights. We talked about it before. So many cards full of Contender Series of lower level guys. That keeps the cost down quite a bit. And with the profits they're posting, it's going to stay that way. So Kevin Lee is the first big name. He will not be the last in this type of situation. I guarantee it. Also, wouldn't be shocked if there's something to do where if you have a USADA suspension, it's easier to cut someone, right? Depending on how the contract's written. Don't know that that's necessarily true, but I kind of feel like it is based on what we've seen a couple of times. But yeah, I mean, it sucks. Kevin Lee will still have a lot of potential in other organizations, but it's, his advice to new fighters was cherry pick your fights. Couldn't agree more. It's what he's echoed. It's what Sean O'Malley's echoed, right? Cherry pick your fights. Because if you lose too many times and you get this perception of, okay, he's good, but he's never going to be a true contender anymore, or he's not a big enough name that we expect him to bounce back in a big way, they'll cut you. Kevin Lee is 29. He is very young in terms of overall career. He could easily have a Charles Oliveira type run, right? Where he kind of reinvents himself and then goes on a massive run, wins the belt. That's what Oliveira did. Go look at Charles Oliveira's record. He was viewed as kind of a middling gatekeeper guy for a long time. And then he went on the crazy run and won it all. Kevin Lee could have easily done that, especially with the skill set he has. If he could have figured out, especially if he moves down to 155 and figures out a good way to get to 155. But even at 170, if he figures out a skill set in the way where he can, really make everything click, he's got the tools. But he was just struggling and probably being paid too much to struggle in that position. That's what happens. It's how it goes. He won't be the last, though. I guarantee it. Mark my words. He will not be the last person you see cut being like, what? Why? He's young and he's like, it doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't they keep him? Always come back to this. It's always dollars and cents for them. It didn't always used to be just that. Dollars and cents have always played a massive part in this, but it didn't always used to be just that. But especially with Endeavor taking over and now fully owning the UFC, where they rely so much on their revenue and profits, you're going to see more of this. Going to see a lot more. You know what? I really like the kid on Contender Series. He had hard-fought battle. You know what? Let's go ahead and give him a contract. And almost everybody gets a contract on Contender Series. And then 3 weeks later, 8 people released. And wait, who's that on the list? Going to be a lot more of those moments coming down the line. So just bracing you, because it's going to happen. It is going to happen. I guarantee it. All right. Next thing we have to talk about, unfortunately, and we won't spend too much time on this, but PFL has decided that they're going to do pay-per-views. There haven't been any specific details in terms of a broadcast partner deal or anything like that, but I mean, they're going to do pay-per-views in 2022, it sounds like. Let's see. Looking at the story from ESPN, I mean, we have pay-per-view talent today in the PFL. Peter Murray, CEO of the PFL, says. A PFL superstar in a class of her own when referring to Kayla Harrison. It just, and it's not confirmed where they're like, we are for sure doing pay-per-views, all of that. It sounds like it's, I don't know. You get the impression reading the article and in the interview that they're going to do pay-per-views in 2022 or at least 2023. It's one of those things where, let's say they do that. Let's say they make the finale a pay-per-view, because with their season, they either have to put on a mega event where they hire some people in and get some like new blood, like similar to how they signed Pettis and McDonald and other people, Brendan Loughlane, outside of the actual season. And so they had them fight kind of lower level guys or had kind of showcase fights. They either sign enough of those people to get together a pay-per-view caliber card, or they do something like make the finale of the season a pay-per-view. Either way, it's, you look at the ratings, and we've talked about the ratings for the PFL, especially last season, and it just doesn't make sense here. The only thing that I can think of is that this is an angle, right, where he doesn't fully commit to doing pay-per-views. He says, we have pay-per-view caliber talent. Kayla Harrison is a pay-per-view star, all of this. He doesn't fully commit to saying we are 100%, we have an event picked out, we're doing a pay-per-view this year. But he says it in a way that if I'm a potential investor or if I'm looking at something, right, like it may make me think, well, okay, maybe he knows something I don't. Maybe he's got metrics that kind of shows that she would be drawing pay-per-views. And pay-per-views, well, that's what the UFC is doing. And look at how much money they're making. If I look up MMA pay-per-views, right, I'm probably going to find a bunch of Conor McGregor numbers and all these things and start going through and doing the math and being like, wow, this could be massive revenue and all this stuff. It's important to remember that a lot of these investors are not well-versed in MMA. They see it on the surface, they see it as a pure investment, and they don't truly understand it. So you've got a guy pitching a tournament format, which is similar to other sports some of these investors will follow, saying, here's the pay-per-view stats, and if you do a quick Google search without doing a crazy deep dive, you kind of see, oh, okay, yeah, there's, pay-per-views can make a lot of money and all this stuff. It not being fully immersed in the sport, so this stuff, especially the business side, something like that can entice particular investors. If they truly do their due diligence, it shouldn't, but again, the investment world is kind of crazy. you will find a lot of investors who do their due diligence and say, nope, I'm out, and do all that. And then you'll find a lot who will invest in things that make no sense, and they're just, sounds like a good idea. They've got the money, they've got deadlines, or they do, a light diligence on it, and they say, oh, that looks good. Okay, sure. And they buy into the idea, right? Because you've got a great salesman in front of them. I mean, that's kind of the investment world. That's what CEOs do. They go out and sell. They sell the brand, they sell the product, they sell everything. That's a lot of their world. So it's tough because, again, you're looking at either that as a scenario, or the PFL really thinks that they can do PFLs pay-per-view successfully. And maybe they just truly believe, like, okay, our ratings aren't that great, but cable's dying, which it kind of is, and they have access to ESPN Plus numbers, right? So that might be higher. So maybe they're looking at it like, we just need to get behind the pay-per-view wall. Like, well, maybe. I don't know. From an outside perspective, it seems crazy, right? Saw a lot of reactions to this, almost all negative. And it's just tough. It's tough to see where this is viable. The only way I can see a pay-per-view working for the PFL where they actually sell a significant number are with a bunch of caveats. One, it's got to be way less than the UFC, right? It's got to be a $20 pay-per-view, like a Ryzen style pay-per-view price. 20, 25 max, but I would say 20 is probably near max for a pay-per-view. You've got to have enough name value. So you're looking at, yes, Kayla Harrison, yes, Clarissa Shields, Roy McDonald, Anthony Pettis, Verdum. If you're signing somebody like Cyborg, you bring them in. But you have some big names and some big matchups. And 3, you can't do it as your season finale. You can't. Because in order to sell that, right, you don't have your names picked out probably by the time that happens. If you've decided, yes, the finale is going to be the pay-per-view event, you don't know how the tournament's going to go. It's one of the gifts and curses of the tournament format. As a purist, it sounds great, but from a, pay-per-view star perspective, think about this year. Think if this year's finale had been a pay-per-view. How many people would have bought that? So many of the name value fighters that they signed didn't make it to the playoffs. Didn't make it to the championship. So it doesn't make sense for you to do the finale, again, unless you're going to add a bunch of showcase fights to the finale as well. You could do that. But then that just makes the event longer, and we all know how long that broadcast was. And the pacing was just, yeah. But it's one of those things where a lot of factors have to line up in order for this to be successful. And I just don't see it. I don't see how it could do that. That's the only way it could be viable, is if you really get big names, especially a newer big name like Cyborg or someone with some real casual viewer drawing power in the mix. Otherwise, there's no way this thing cracks 100K. It probably doesn't even get anywhere near 100K. You'd have to have big names coming in some form or fashion. But he also didn't commit, saying, like, we are 100% doing pay-per-views. Right? That's big too. I mean, he alluded to it. And he talks about the Challenger Series, which is similar to, I guess, Dana White's Contender Series, which is just, yeah, it's just something, to find new guys, which, sure, do that and bring them in on lower contracts, I guess, and maybe it's like a way into the tourney. That's cool, but, I mean, you're still... it says, and in this article, I'm looking again, plans to schedule standalone pay events outside its season format with the hopes of attracting game-changing talent, needle movers who want to come fight under the PFL banner on our pay-per-view platform. I mean, that certainly sounds, without saying we are doing pay-per-view events 100% next year. I mean, and at least saying the specific events, that pretty much sounds like they're doing it. And good luck to them. And to the investors that are going to back this, good luck as well. But, I mean, it's one of those things. I don't know, y'all. I just don't know. We'll wait and see. See if they've got a rabbit in the hat. Because, man, it's a no-go for me. It is a no-go for me right now. But we'll see. I've been wrong before. Prove me wrong again, PFL. I like you guys. Prove me wrong again. All right, so the last thing I have for you guys is a special treat. This is from Scott McCrite. I hope I'm saying that correctly, Scott. Who messaged me on Twitter. And again, you can DM me on Twitter at alldayoj. You can comment on this YouTube video if you're watching it on YouTube. Those are the best ways to get in touch with me. Instagram is very hit and miss for me, so I recommend Twitter or that. But got a question from Scott that I wanted to answer on this. So question is, what is the baseline for pay-per-view? How many fans procure every UFC pay-per-view? And if a baseline is, say, 300K and a non-Conor pay-per-view does 450K and a Conor pay-per-view does 1 million, could that be 3 levels of fans? The hardcore, casual plus Conor. Wanted to kind of know a little bit more about that. So thank you for the question, Scott. It's a great question. And I do have an answer for you. So it's hard to say right now what the baseline for pay-per-views in general is. COVID definitely increased it, I would say, because they did reach a bigger audience by being the first sport back, getting a lot of celebrity fans, that type of thing. But, you know, before they went under ESPN Plus, it was generally around like 200, 300K, depending on who was fighting. But you had a lot of events where they were selling around 200K, 250K. I think Whitaker Romero 2, which was just a spectacular event, top to bottom, did around 250-ish, something like that, or 300. You know, it was that range. And then you'd get the occasional super fight, it would bump it up. You had, you know, various super fights. I think DC Stipe did 400K-ish, right? Or near 500K. So you get that. And then you had the draws, which of course Conor, million plus. Ronda, million plus. John Jones, 800K. That type of thing. Then you moved under the ESPN Plus model. And for a while it was much lower than before because you had to go through a single platform. So, you know, very first one was UFC 235, I believe, or 236. Forget which one. But it was the number, I don't remember, but it was Adesanya Gastelum and Poirier Holloway, right? Those were the two main and co-main. That did like 65K or something, which is crazy when you think about those 4 being in the main and co-main. But it was, again, that adjustment from, hey, I'm going to buy this on my TV. I see ads for it on my TV. I'm going to go ahead and click it, buy, it's all good. To, oh, no, I've got to buy an ESPN Plus subscription. I have to log into that and then pay the pay-per-view. You had a lot of people who were kind of old school fans, who've been around, older fans, right? Who didn't have great internet. They had cable, so they could, you know, easily buy it through that, but they didn't have great internet connections, so they didn't want to deal with it. You had a very clunky ESPN Plus, which is still clunky, but especially starting out was just a mess. So, you know, those numbers were low and then they kind of gradually went up. The baseline now, I would say, is probably around 300K still. It's kind of gotten back to what it was pre-ESPN Plus, especially with the COVID bump, like 300-ish, 400, 300 to 400. You've also got a lot more people that draw in more divisions, I would say, right? You've got Usman now being kind of a proven draw. You've got Izzy in middleweight. You did have Habib, and you still have Conor, right? Drawing in lightweight. My guess is Dustin will draw when he fights against Oliveira. You know, you've got a bigger base of stars and a bigger base of fans, especially with the COVID bump. So I would say 300 to 400 right now, 300 probably being the good estimate for what the semi-baseline is. You still have bad events, right? Nunes, her last headline pay-per-view was like under 100K or near under 100K or 120, something like that. Not great. She's not a great pay-per-view draw for whatever reason. You have those scenarios, but it's generally 250, 300, I would say. I'll say 300 is the base. Let's just go with that. So then you talk about different levels of fans and tiers. It's interesting because Lawrence Epstein, UFC COO, said in an interview a while back during the pandemic that they've got a ton of metrics and they actually segment fans into 7 different categories at least. So what you're talking about, Scott, with the casual, hardcore, casual plus, it really, in the UFC's mind, is chopped up into far more granular than that, where it's like probably purely casual, never really bought a pay-per-view other than once or twice, in their life. You've got the people that maybe buy a pay-per-view every year. I'll buy a pay-per-view if a particular fighter is on. I will buy a pay-per-view every now and then if I like enough fighters on the card. The hardcore of hardcore, I'm buying the pay-per-view, doesn't matter who you're putting on there. Let's go, let's do it. I'm pretty hardcore except when you give me an absolute garbage pay-per-view and then I'm just not paying for it. I don't know that those are the actual segments, but that's the view the UFC is looking at it through, is at least 7 different tiers of fan. And if you ever bought a pay-per-view, occasionally they'll send out a survey. And I've received some, I'm sure some of you have received some, where they say like, how often do you watch? Do you watch fight nights? How likely would you be willing to buy a pay-per-view at a particular price? They do these surveys to kind of create and mark those tiers and put people into those customer segments. And then they market towards those customer segments. They find what fighters draw and will get, especially the more casual customer segments, to pony up and pay money to watch them fight. And they push them with marketing. That's how they allocate their marketing money. So it's much more granular than that. You have the right idea with what you were talking about, Scott, but and I feel like a lot of people don't know this, it's much more granular in the UFC's mind. They really take a look at a bunch of different numbers. Dana White alluded to this as well during an interview where he talked about Chase Hooper's numbers, right? He said, Chase Hooper's fight on the Contender Series, that had so many views, like the most views we ever had. That's why he's gotten part of the push. They look at a ton of data. They are big on data aggregation to then make decisions. They take it all up, analyze it, and then say, you know what, this is what we're seeing here. We're going to push this. This is what we're seeing here. They're a firm that follows the belief that big data should drive your decisions. They definitely are. So it's a great question. The interesting part is that in general, you don't have too many stars that hit that middle ground. They either tend to be a Conor or Adesanya type, right? Or they take Conor's type of shine, similar to what Diaz did and then Masvidal did to him, and Usman. They either do that, or they're maybe drawing for a super fight. If there's a champ versus champ fight going on, or a very particularly compelling bout where maybe the B side is a little bit more of a draw, then they're drawing, but you don't get a lot of middle ground. You tend to kind of get the baseline, or you get the superstardom. Usman going out and fighting Colby and getting 700K buys, he's closer to that Adesanya range. Jones at one point fought Anthony Smith, and I think they were pinned it around 550K buys. Like, he's kind of the middle range, right? I would say Adesanya right now is your biggest consistent draw outside of McGregor, who doesn't fight enough except for this past year. Or he fought multiple times, but otherwise really doesn't fight enough to be the consistent draw. So you've got Adesanya as the draw, and then you've got, Usman now and Jones. And then it's those three guys. Conor way out here when he does fight. Maybe Dustin joins those three guys in terms of where they are. And then it's generally like 300 or lower. It's interesting. It's very, very interesting. But they definitely look at even more customer segments than that. And they're trying to get more people that will raise their base. I think that's part of maybe why the base pay-per-view has risen as well. They've definitely looked at how fighters are attracting those middle customer segments who are kind of semi-casual or might be interested for the right fighter, and they found ways to target them and make them more consistent pay-per-view buys. I think that's a big part of their strategy. That's where they want to go. If they're actually hitting their ROI on that or not through marketing and other services, I'm not sure. We don't have that info, but I would assume based on what Epstein has said, based on what Dana White has said, that's their strategy, is continually find guys that get past the hardcore level and get into, 3 or 4 of those 7 customer segments minimum, and then raise the overall base of your pay-per-view buys. I think that's the end goal, right? Because ideally you want everybody bringing in 800K buys, 1 million buys. You want everybody to be a Conor. But whether or not they've succeeded in there or not, I'm not sure. But that just, again, gives you some insight into what the UFC is doing. So great question, Scott. Appreciate it. If you have any more, make sure to hit me up again. Anybody else out there with questions, hit me up. I'll be happy to answer them on the show when I can. All right, everybody. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Fight Business Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, watching, whatever you're doing. If you're on YouTube, make sure you hit that like, subscribe, bell notification, drop some comments if you have any questions. Let me know how you feel about these topics. What are your thoughts on Triller's purses, especially Kevin Lee getting released, all that fun stuff? Let me know. If you're on Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, what have you, appreciate you guys listening. Feel free to drop me a line if you have questions or anything at any time. With that in mind, we will be back next week. Episode will probably be released a little bit earlier next week. I will keep you up to date on that as soon as I know more. Again, check Twitter for updates there. But with that in mind, thank you so much for listening. Appreciate you guys supporting this. And until next time, get money.